Uh, those of you in my course on War, Peace, and Strategy will unfortunately hear a lot of familiar points today, but you probably still shouldn't doze off since I'll sneak a few new ones in too. Realism is a messy theory if you take the whole tradition spanning millennia and thinking about international relations. As with other major compelling ideas like Christianity or Marxism, original precepts spawn a lot of sects which develop in various directions. They share some basic principles, but they differ a lot on many related issues. Realists disagree with each other frequently. There are classical realists and structural or neo-realists, offensive realists and defensive realists on variations of other kinds. Some realists are Democrats, some Republicans, some Marxists, some libertarians. So realism does definitely not provide a formula for policy in any detail. And this will lead some practical people to be impatient with the notion that grappling with the theory is necessary or worth the time. My bias is eclectic. I've been accused in print by a realist of being a non-realist and by a non-realist of being a realist. I do believe realism is inadequate in many respects, but I view it as Winston Churchill viewed democracy. I think realism is the worst theory of international relations, except for all the others. Now remember, these paradigms we deal with and we insist inflicting on you at Columbia are general predispositions. A few people's views fit very snugly in any of the paradigms, except for a few fanatics. And note E.H. Carr's reflections on the limitations of realism, which he includes in a book which is otherwise a consummate statement of realist thought. Now, some people believe realism is a scientific theory, and others that it's really just an attitude toward the human condition. I incline more toward the latter view. In any case, realism is a general theory about how the world usually works, but it's not a formula for predicting how things will work in specific cases, where particular circumstances, idiosyncrasies of political leaders, or other sources of chance may produce decisions by governments that don't accord with the tenets of realist theory. Classical realism we usually think of in terms of the tradition of Thucydides, Machiavelli, Hobbes, and in more recent times, Hans Morgenthau and E.H. Carr, or Reinhold Niebuhr. It emphasizes flaws in human nature, the natural prevalence of conflicts of interests, power-seeking motives, the dominance of material interests over legal or moral norms in determining the actions of political units, mainly nation states, but within fractured polities that are undergoing civil war, contending groups that want to create or replace regimes and build new states. Robert Gilpin notes three assumptions of realism. First, the essentially conflictual nature of international affairs. Second, that the essence of social reality is the group, not the individuals of liberal thought nor the classes of Marxism. Homo sapiens is a tribal species, he says. And third, the primacy in all political life of power and security in human motivation. This is not to say that power and security are the sole or even the most important objectives, Gilpin writes. He says, we prize beauty, truth, and goodness. What the realist seeks to stress is that all these more noble goals will be lost unless one makes provision for one's security in the power struggle among social groups. Well, more recently, structural realism or neo-realism, associated with Kenneth Waltz and John Mearsheimer, try to present a more rigorously scientific formulation of the realist tradition. And they emphasize even more the causal effect of international anarchy. In another book that you're not assigned for this course at least, Waltz's Man, the State, and War, he talks about the difference between permissive and efficient causes. The permissive cause is what makes something possible, though not inevitable. And the efficient cause is what makes it happen in a particular instance. The permissive cause is the international system, defined in terms of anarchy. There's just no sovereign above the level of states. Or as he quotes Rousseau, wars occur because there is nothing to prevent them. Now note, in this, anarchy does not mean chaos or constant violence. It means simply the lack of a sovereign, the lack of enforcement authority, above the level of the state. Without world government, anarchy makes states, or groups within countries without coherent or effective functioning states, makes them the ultimate judges and enforcers of their own rights and interests, moral or material rights and interests, as they see them. When states or groups in civil conflict disagree about whose claims are legitimate, power determines which of the claims will prevail. Nothing but counterpower can prevent the use of force by a state or group that considers the status quo unacceptable. For the efficient cause, Waltz says, look to the levels of analysis below the international system, domestic politics, particular leaders and ideologies. There's a prevalent misconception that Waltz believes that domestic factors don't matter. He thinks they matter a great deal if you're trying to explain why something happens at a particular time. And he makes an important distinction, which is lost on many people, between a theory of international politics and a theory of foreign policy. Theory of international politics is about average outcomes over time, why wars recur. A theory of foreign policy is one that explains why a government makes a decision for or against war in particular circumstances for particular reasons. Waltz says in Man, the State, and War, war may result because State A has something that State B wants. The efficient cause of the war is the desire of State B. The permissive cause is the fact that there's nothing to prevent State B from undertaking the risks of war. He goes on, if an effect is produced by two or more causes, the effect is not permanently eliminated by removing one of them. An endeavor launched against one cause to the neglect of others may make the situation worse instead of better. Thus, as the Western democracies became more inclined to peace, Hitler became more belligerent. The increased propensity to peace of some participants in international politics may increase rather than decrease the likelihood of war. Anarchy defines political order in the international sphere because there's no world government. No legislature, court, or executive, complete with police force, to arrest those who violate the law and threaten public order. That's why Waltz calls the international system a self-help system. Or, as John Mearsheimer says, what happens when a country calls 911? Nothing. There's no one on the other end of the line. There is no 911 in the international system. Well, wait a minute, you might say. Is the United Nations 911? Or NATO? Or Uncle Sam? No, it's not the same. Those organs are like a friendly neighbor you can call on to ask for help if you're getting burglarized. They're only organizations with member countries who may or may not come to your aid if it suits them. Ban Ki-moon has no troops of his own and never will have, at least until the United Nations becomes some form of world government. You can try calling a friendly neighbor, another country you want to ally with and support you, but whether that neighbor comes to your aid is up to her. When Kuwait called in 1990, we answered and came. When Darfur called last year or this year, we said, sorry, can't make it this time. There's no organized, institutionalized enforcement authority, always standing by in the international system that you can count on to make governments or groups do the right thing. As we've seen, the United Nations and the World Court in The Hague don't fill the bill. When the World Court gave a verdict against the United States on the mining of Nicaraguan harbors in the 1980s, the Reagan administration said, get lost. And nothing happened to the United States. Nobody arrested the United States and sent it to prison. Maybe somebody should have, but no one, no international institution, no other government could, so no one did. In the international system, you're on your own. You and your friends have to act as your own court and your own police, or else submit to whoever else is willing to do so. Multilateral enforcement, for example, NATO's action against Serbia in 1999, the war over Kosovo, is not analogous to domestic law enforcement by courts or legal authorities. Rather, it's more analogous to vigilantes organizing a posse. The same logic can apply to conflicts within states, to civil wars or revolutions, when central government institutions collapse, or when large segments of populations no longer consider them legitimate and seek to overthrow them or secede from them. At that point, you can say there's anarchy within the state until order is reestablished by a new regime or partition that comes out of civil war, just like anarchy that's the permanent condition in the international system. Now, realists are most focused on the problem of war and peace, unlike liberals or constructivists who are at least as interested, and probably more so, in some other issues, such as economic development and trade, ideology, the character of domestic regimes, and other big issues that affect human welfare. How do they, as opposed to other schools of thought, see the problem of war? Well, one difference, I think, that defines the instincts a lot of people bring to this question is the difference between seeing the cause of war in evil or in tragedy. To oversimplify very roughly, liberals tend to assume the problem of war comes from evil, and realists tend to assume that it comes from tragedy. Evil in the sense of aggression. Aggression comes from human nature and sin. Bad people commit aggression. Aggression is a crime. Or aggression comes from bad states, bad regimes, while good states only defend themselves. Autocracies make war, democracies make peace, and so on. The view that emphasizes tragedy tends to believe that war comes from genuine conflicts of interests, sometimes in which both sides have reasonable claims, or certainly claims that they themselves see as reasonable. Or it can come from misunderstanding, misperception, miscalculation. The problem of the security dilemma. The security dilemma image means that you have two states, neither of whom want war with each other, but who are suspicious of each other's intentions. So state A, in order to guard against the worst possibilities, starts arming itself so that state B can't take advantage of it. State B sees state arming and says, uh-oh, we'd better tool up too, and starts increasing its armaments. State A then sees that and says, aha, we knew it. They're out to get us. And you get this figurative cycle or escalation of action and reaction, competition that increases suspicion and tension, causes arms races, may make crises more likely, and at worst, potentially inadvertent war. Well, which is the main danger? The security dilemma or aggression? In a way, these notions are capsulized in the prevalent images people have of the origins of World War I and World War II. In 1914, the image many have is that a cycle of action and reaction got out of control, and the states of Europe were unable to escape the escalation that led to war, even though none of them really wanted what followed. Whereas in 1938, at Munich, people seeking to avoid exactly that problem of escalating tension solved the problem, they thought, in a different way by reassuring Germany, but turned out to be wrong about the Germans' ambitions and the limits of those ambitions, and ended up allowing aggression to succeed. But how do you know which situation you're in? That is often what the most intense national security debates are about. There are risks of misperception in either direction. You can try to deter a state you're worried about, but then risk provoking it if you assume aggression is the danger, while the reality is the security dilemma, as in the popular image of 1914. Or you can reassure that state and be victimized if its real intent is aggressive, as with Germany at the end of the 1930s. I also find it useful to sort of clarify some images to make analogies to domestic law and adjudication. Those who focus on the problem of evil or unprovoked aggression tend to see war as a matter, figuratively, of criminal law. One transgressor is at fault, like a murderer or thief who threatens domestic peace. And that transgressor has to be stopped and taken out of action. Instead of Charles Manson or Ted Bundy and domestic arenas, it's an Adolf Hitler or a Saddam Hussein. Those who focus on tragedy or misunderstanding tend to see war as a problem more akin to civil law, where disputes over contracts or divorce or similar matters have two sides, where right and wrong are not always clearly divided, where both sides believe themselves to be in the right. Whichever the case may be, why do political disputes produce war rather than litigation? Because litigation only resolves problems when either both parties to the case accept the legitimacy and finality of the court's decision, even if it goes against them, or if either of the parties does not accept it, the court can enforce its decision. It does that by dispatching police to arrest offending parties and put them in jail, or by garnishing a salary to pay a judgment, or by seizing property and transferring it to the party who won the suit. Litigation would have worked in regard to the mining of Nicaraguan harbors if the World Court in The Hague could have punished the United States. The point is, within a state, a court can make its writ stick because there's an executive authority to enforce it. There is no comparable structure of accepted legitimate authority or of enforcement power in the international system, to repeat myself, or within failed states or ones riven by rebellion. And this is, above all, what realism emphasizes about the meaning of anarchy. In fact, war is the real analog to litigation in the international system. Peaceful settlements are analogous to settling out of court in domestic legal disputes. In the domestic legal system, if you're getting a divorce or challenging the interpretation of a bequest in a will or suing a contractor for fraud, it's in everyone's interest, normally, to reach a settlement out of court because litigation is expensive and it could leave both parties to the dispute worse off than if they can agree on a resolution of the dispute. Don't have to pay all that money for lawyers for years on end. But sometimes it proves impossible to settle out of court, and litigation ensues. Same in international disputes. Usually the parties to international disputes settle peacefully because they know war would be awful, might leave them both worse off. But sometimes they can't agree, and the equivalent of litigation, violent contest, ensues. Now, some at some times have hoped that the United Nations would be that supranational authority that could enforce international law, that so-called global governance would supersede self-help in the international system and rein in the resort to war. But exactly what is the difference between global governance and world government? Now, I know there are political scientists who will make very clear what the difference is, but in my obtuse way, I just went to the dictionary and looked, and the dictionary doesn't distinguish the two very clearly. In any case, the United Nations is not a world government. So should worriers now proclaim that the United Nations is in crisis because the United States ignores it when deciding to wage war? No, or at least not that the current crisis is newer or deeper than in the past. I'd say the United Nations recently has just reverted to what it has been for most of its history, that is, during the Cold War. And the real unmasking of the United Nations overreaching in the post-Cold War era came long before the United States ignored it in attacking Iraq. And this, I think, illustrates some of the criticisms that realists level at idealists who don't pay attention to power. And that is, I'd say, the real unmasking of the limits of the United Nations came in 1995 at Srebrenica, when the United Nations boldly proclaimed a safe area for Bosnian Muslims to be protected from attack by Bosnian Serbs. Problem was, the UN had no means to enforce it. If I recall correctly, it was one puny Dutch battalion, which, when faced with the Serb army, just melted away. As a result of that, approximately 7,000 Bosnian Muslims, by the most prominent estimates, were rounded up and murdered. I think it's a shameful but classic example of what realism sees as folly, the reliance on law or rhetoric to protect people without backing by military power. Realism's argument is, if you make demands or assurances that you can't back up with power, you're foolish at best and at worst horribly destructive. There's been a lot of rhetoric about the rule of international law, but a realist would say the only law that rules is the interpretation of international law by the most powerful states in the system. When they disagree about what international law really says, as prosecution and defense attorneys disagree in domestic courtrooms, the law has no effect independent of power. Claims of universal jurisdiction, which have become more popular in recent times, are really statements of aspiration or wishfulness rather than reality in this view. When a great power refuses to sign a treaty, it's not bound by the treaty, despite what some observers now assert, as when they claim that treaties like the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, become binding once they've passed a certain threshold in the number of ratifications, even binding on those who don't adhere to them. But the United States is not going to be bound by the International Criminal Court, whether it should be or not. And in fact, the United States is using its power to induce other countries to back off from their adherence to the International Court by exempting Americans in those countries from the jurisdiction of the ICC. Power trumps law in other ways in international life that differ profoundly from the role of law inside stable societies, realists would argue. For example, Belgium was compelled to scale back its own war crimes law in order to appease the United States after the US government threatened to move NATO headquarters out of Belgium. But what about realism and morality? There's a prevalent image of realism as amoral. In one sense, this is true, but not really. Instead, I think it has to be understood in terms of utilitarian or consequentialist versions of morality, where ethics are shaped by the imperatives of survival. And see the Holzman and Levin article on that you're assigned. I apologized. I recommended Elliot Cohen's and my little article be assigned before I had read the Levin one, which you can probably get away with substituting for that if you haven't read them all yet. Hans Morgenthau would emphasize that you should focus on the difference between what is and what ought to be, between the desirable and the possible. If what's desirable is not possible, trying to do what's desirable may be at best futile, at worst counterproductive and destructive. Realists worry about paving the road to hell with good intentions. Srebrenica yesterday, Darfur tomorrow. E.H. Carr argues that idealists let wishing dominate thinking, and that realists make thinking dominate wishing. Robert Gilpin writes, moral commitment lies at the heart of realism. What Morgenthau and many other realists have in common is a belief that ethical and political behavior will fail unless it takes into account the actual practice of states and the teaching of sound theory. Machiavelli argues in various ways that sometimes the prince has to do evil in order to do good. Thus, in the liberal tradition of the West, Machiavellian has a pejorative connotation. And it is often said, the ends do not justify the means. Well, of course, the ends don't always justify the means, but they must sometime if you ever believe in waging war for any purpose. Because a decision to wage war, including in self-defense, simply resisting an attack, means a decision to get a lot of people killed who might otherwise live. A decision that that is the lesser evil. A decision that defending some value, whether it's humanitarian relief for benighted populations or your own political integrity or anything else, is the lesser evil compared to war at that point. If you believe the end never justifies the means, then it seems to me you can never believe in any war, however noble or just the asserted purpose might be. No war against Hitler to prevent National Socialism from ruling all of Europe. No war against the Confederacy in the United States in the 1860s to free the slaves. No war for anything. But if you believe that some things are worth killing for, some values are so important self-defense or other values, then you're on that slippery slope of deciding exactly when and how much certain ends may justify certain means. Morgenthau emphasizes that realists aim for the lesser evil, and they subordinate abstract principle to material interest, essentially a pragmatic argument. In a sense, also the difference between what Max Weber calls the ethic of absolute ends and the ethic of responsibility. In other words, a realist would say no principle should be honored to the absolute if it has awful consequences. So in a way, one thing that illustrates this argument starkly and in a way that's maybe surprising to modern sensibilities is the controversy over the lying Baptists. And I don't remember the details, but essentially, if I recall somewhat correctly, there was a controversy in the 19th century between different sects of Baptists over this hypothetical situation. If a family on the frontier is attacked by Indians or Native Americans, and the parents tell the kids to go out and hide in a culvert behind the barn, and the Indians take the parents prisoners and ask if there's anyone else there, should the parents tell the truth and say the children are out behind the barn, or should they lie and say no one else is here? And the argument was, for some, the absolute principle that you must not lie had to be honored because you couldn't compromise the principle. And the pragmatic counter-argument is that's ridiculous because then that gets your children killed. Well, that may seem the simplistic form of the argument, but in more complex ways, that is a part of the realist critique of taking principles too far. Or the example Morgenthau gave about the Soviet invasion of Finland in 1939 to 40, after the outbreak of war over Poland. British wanted to aid the Finns against the Soviets and were prevented because Sweden wouldn't allow troops to transit their country. And Morgenthau's argument was how insane it was for the British to think about going to war with the Soviet Union at that point to defend Finland just over the principle of aggression when they were already, as it were, fighting for their lives against Germany. This would have been cutting their own throats. Would it have been moral to invite defeat in war at the price of letting the Nazis rule Europe, just to uphold Finland's legal rights? In a certain way, one might argue, and I'll maybe reveal my biases, you see something of that with neoconservative arguments about Iran today. There are some arguing that the United States should attack Iran, despite the fact that we happen to be bogged down in a catastrophic war in Iraq already. Realists would criticize that as unwise at best. Realism's view on the use of force as an instrument of policy is sometimes misconstrued. There's a prevalent notion that realists are hawks and like to use force. No, at least not all the time. They're hawks about preparing capabilities for war, but much less so about fighting wars when they can be avoided. There's no simple correlation between ideological values or international relations theories and opinion on the use of force. During the Cold War, both realists and liberals were split on the matter of the Vietnam War. You had realists like George Kennan opposing the war, and a realist like Henry Kissinger supporting it. Similarly, you had liberal senators like Scoop Jackson and George McGovern on opposite ends of that issue. Some people forget that Jackson's ADA rating was higher than George McGovern's. Jackson was a big supporter of the war. Well, on balance, the question is, what's the standard for going to war? Realists would tend to say that it's when important national interests in a material sense or the maintenance of the balance of power is at stake. Whereas liberals would tend to say that it should be when political values or moral principles are at stake. Plenty of exceptions to this simplistic formulation, but I think that's the sort of crayon version of the difference. In the post-Cold War era, Who was most often calling for the use of force by the United States for intervention with military means? I think it was more often liberal hawks. You didn't find many people identified as realists clamoring to go to war in the Balkans or Iraq. And then you have the phenomenon of the present President of the United States, who started out as, in some rough or ready sense, more or less a cautious realist, saying the United States shouldn't be involved in nation building or interventions here and there, but then was converted overnight by the events of September 11th into a liberal crusader. Why do realists focus so much on military power? War is never a first-choice instrument of policy, but it's always an available instrument. It's preferred when other instruments fail and the alternative of peace poses unacceptable losses. Force is the ultima ratio regem, that is, the final arbiter of disputes when all else, all peaceful means of negotiation and bargaining, fail to resolve it. Most disputes are settled without violence, because no one wants to spend blood and treasure if it can be avoided. But occasionally, conflict of interest proves intractable. Compromise proves infeasible, and neither side would rather concede than fight. Then force or the threat of force determines who rules on the matter. Countries need military power not because war is likely, but just because it's possible. They need to keep military forces at the ready in peacetime because they never know when things may go bad, when an adversary may change his intentions, and intentions can change quickly, overnight, in an election or a coup d'etat or a cabinet shuffle. But modern military capabilities cannot change overnight. It takes many years to field a modern Army, Navy, and Air Force. It takes time to convert resources into mobilized force structures to recruit, organize, equip, train, and deploy them in forms capable of combat. So if you want the option to fight next year, you need to have begun preparing many years ago. Now here I'm talking about modern warfare, not primitive, low-tech warfare that has characterized much of recent conflict in the international system in the Balkans and Africa in the 1990s, or insurgencies in Iraq and Afghanistan today. One statement compatible with realism was used graphically by someone who is generally identified as a critic of realism, and that's Joseph Nye, who was a Harvard professor and served in the Carter State Department, and in the course of the rebirth of the Cold War in the 1970s began adjusting some of the ideas he had become famous for in academia, declaring the declining utility of force and the obsolescence of realism. And he later served as Assistant Secretary of Defense in the Clinton administration. But Nye said, security is like oxygen. You never worry about it until you don't have it. And then it's all you worry about. So military power, in a sense, is the emergency oxygen tank for the rare occasions when an adversary may suck security away. Realists believe that war is natural. Natural meaning what occurs in nature, not meaning good, just natural. And states are also subject to natural selection. Now it's true, in recent years, not many states have gone out of business completely, although historically a number did. But a lot of them suffer a great deal. Germany lost a third of its territory in the 20th century as a result of trying to enlarge itself. In the last century, Mexico lost almost half its territory to guess who? And there are other examples. So, states need military power to prevent war if possible, and if they can't prevent it, to win it. Military power may also, hopefully, prevent war via deterrence. That is, by making clear to an adversary that if she attacks, either your successful defense or your devastating retaliation will make her wish she hadn't, convince her that the costs exceed the gains, and therefore prevent the resort to war. In In this sense, military power need not be used to be useful. In fact, the most successful use of military power is when it remains in the background and never has to actually be employed in combat. It's always in the background of diplomacy on significant international political disputes, even when the option to use force doesn't appear to be on the table. Now, this is not true of all negotiations, of course, not about trade negotiations or disputes on many matters, but regarding any dispute over who will make a final political decision on a matter of vital political interest. Clausewitz said that combat is like cash payment in commerce. There are a lot of interactions and deals that occur without any money actually changing hands. But always in the background of all these deals is what would happen at the end of the day when money does change hands. Similarly, many deals are made, many coercive actions undertaken in international affairs that are shaped by the estimates of what would happen if it were to come to blows. Military power may keep some grievances from being pursued, since it's clear that the weaker party can't do anything to force a rectification of injustice. Why has Mexico stopped complaining about all the territory the United States grabbed from it in the 1840s? Well, I suspect one reason is they know they can't do anything about it. Realism focuses on military power because it determines whose claims prevail when disagreements can't be resolved by negotiation. So war is about who rules, who controls the disposition of whatever stakes are in dispute, who calls the tune in peacetime after the shooting stops. For realists, this usually means which countries will, or more importantly, will not control the international system, or which groups will control the government within a country in a civil war. For liberals, usually this means which type of regime will rule within countries. Thus, realists generally prefer not to intervene in civil wars unless the result is likely to affect the balance of power among states, while liberals believe ultimate stability of the international system depends on the quality of governments within it, and thus are more interested in promoting democratization and improvements of governments, sometimes by force. Consider Bosnia. Why did some oppose Western intervention and others support it? Liberals tended to see the Serbs as culprits, guilty of aggression or war crimes. Realists tended to see the moral claims as less clear or more mixed, and saw the issue as being in a gray area rather than one of black or white. Liberals in the West in the early 1990s wanted to intervene to stop bloodshed and roll back Serb conquests, but few wanted to pay very significant costs for doing so. Liberals want enforcement, but often back away if the price is much bloodshed. Finally, in 1995, NATO did some serious bombing, which in combination with the unilateral Croatian offensive on the ground in Krajina, put the Serbs on the defensive. And we got the Dayton agreements, which appeared to settle the war peacefully. But how? By incorporating mutually contradictory provisions that aimed in principle to reestablish an integrated unitary Bosnian state, but also recognized de facto the partition of the country among the three contending ethnic groups. The settlement thus did not settle the political question, the question of who rules, and rested on the continuing presence and policing by outside occupiers. So I can only wonder how Iraq, and we will avoid that fate. Now, can the United States really shape and control some rocky transition toward democracy in a way that doesn't leave the Shiites attempting to impose tyranny of the majority, or leaving the Kurds determined to exclude the writ of Baghdad's authority, leaving the Sunnis desperate to prevent their marginalization? Can such a situation be brought about without going from current low-grade civil war to all-out civil war? Realists would be skeptical that it's going to be possible to do that without a much larger war. Liberals would be more hopeful that the process of government development and reconciliation may avoid that. And all this also indicates that war is usually about states, the relations between them in the international sphere, or regarding civil wars or revolutions or wars of independence about how states will be formed and organized and controlled, whose state it will be, under what conditions. Is realism's emphasis on states passé? There's a lot more sentiment in that direction, perhaps right after the Cold War, before a number of things started going sour again. But also, the conflicts of the post-September 11th world are not so clearly about states. The perpetrators of those attacks were a transnational group concerned mainly with opposing the effect of American power and perhaps Western culture on numerous societies. So this evokes the question of new cleavages in world politics, argued by Samuel Huntington in his book, The Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of World Order, which I see as a constructivist argument about international conflict and order. But states certainly are critical ingredients in any political violence. The formation of an anti-terrorist coalition, for example, depends on states. U.S. military action against the Taliban and Al-Qaeda in the Middle East depends on relations with governments that supply bases and cooperate in anti-terror campaigns. Pakistan, Uzbekistan, Saudi Arabia, and others. It's often said that states have become much less important in world politics, that globalization reduces the ability of states to control things. Does this mean then that war has become less important, perhaps is even becoming obsolete? Well, first, there's less to the decline of the state than meets the eye. In some respects, states now have less control over some important aspects, especially of economics, than they once did. Yet states remain alive and kicking. And it's interesting how many people in so many places around the world since the end of the Cold War have been fighting like hell to get and shape their own states. And some who see globalization as an unprecedented wave of the future perhaps exaggerate how much control states had traditionally. And indeed, states loom larger in the lives of their citizens than they did in earlier times. Kenneth Waltz likes to point out that Western states now dispose of far larger proportions of gross economic product of their societies than ever before. And for some reason, there have been more people organized groups in the world in the past few years, as I said, fighting fiercely to establish their own states or take control of them than ever before in the past century, whether it's Bosnia, Tajikistan, Cambodia, Afghanistan, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Rwanda, Kosovo, Sudan, East Timor, Chechnya, and the list goes on. Some contemporary wars take place in weak, failed, or non-existent states, for example, Somalia or Congo. But they're about states, attempts to create states, to take control of them and reshape them or develop them into functioning authorities, or at least if not in the sense of some elaborate, articulated modern nation state, at least a political unit that at least provides opportunities for kleptocracy. Well, is realism a guide for policy? Said it's not a formula for policy. And there's also always been an argument about whether realism is an empirical theory or a normative one. And I'd say the answer is both. Essentially, it's an argument that the odds are over time, if states or groups do not act in a certain way to watch out for their power position, they're going to be vulnerable and suffer for it. And therefore, since that happens as a matter of reality, states have to act in accord with those principles to survive, and therefore they should do it. It's a somewhat circular and confusing argument, but I think that's essentially what most realists would say when they're charged with making an argument that it's both the way the world works and criticizing governments for not acting in the way that realism dictates. Sometimes realists and liberals or constructivists agree on what policy choices should be made, but for different reasons. And sometimes realists disagree among themselves about what should be done in a specific case, as much as they do with other schools of thought. The main point that differentiates realists is their focus on how policy options depend on and will affect the balance of power in the international system, as opposed to what the legal or moral principles in dispute are, which are the priorities to idealists. Some examples of situations where realism and idealism diverge. I mentioned the Winter War in Finland in 1939 to 40, or Nixon and the rapprochement with China in 1972. Nixon was conservative, and China was at that time in the midst of the Cultural Revolution. Maoism was the ultimate anti-liberal ideology, viewed at that time as every bit as wild and crazy as North Korea or Iran or Saddam Hussein's Iraq have been viewed in your lifetimes. But the realist argument that Nixon and Kissinger had was essentially in order to counterbalance a rising Soviet Union. Yes, at that time the Soviet Union was seen as rising. That the ideological differences, the difference in values that was so profound between the United States and China had to be disregarded in order to form a tacit reliance against the Soviet Union. Iraq in 1991, after the first Persian Gulf War, you had the realist view that was dominant in Daddy Bush's administration, people like Brent Scowcroft, or the old Dick Cheney, before his heart operations, making the prudent argument that it was not a good idea to try to overthrow Saddam Hussein because that would threaten to break up Iraq, make Iran more powerful. The opposition, maybe most articulately voiced by Paul Wolfowitz, saying that we had encouraged the Iraqis to revolt. We'd put them out on a limb, especially what happened with the Shiites in the south after the end of the war and the Kurds in the north, and that we were morally bound to support them and to do everything we could to overthrow Saddam Hussein because his regime was so awful. I also mentioned Srebrenica in 1995, UN legalism without backing by military power ending in massacre. What about in the future? What would realism or liberalism suggest about how to handle U.S.-Chinese relations if China continues to rise economically? Should the United States want China to develop economically, to become rich and prosperous, as it has been doing for the past 25 years? Well, liberals would generally say, sure, economic interdependence fosters peace. Now, this is opposed to the argument in Waltz's book that interdependence causes conflict. But in liberal ideology, the trading system based on comparative advantage and peaceful competition makes both the United States and China richer and better off. So a rich China will be a bigger market for American products. More Chinese military power won't matter because mutual interests in cooperation for economic purposes to profit through peaceful exchange rather than destructive conflict will prevent military conflict, which would only seem irrational. Realists, though, would be probably more inclined to say probably not. The United States should not be happy about an economically developing China. The argument being that a rich China will be powerful and more able to throw its weight around and threaten the interests of the United States and its allies in the region. That growing power creates growing ambitions, and that there's nothing bad or evil or wrong about this. It's natural. Robert Gilpin's argument that a rising challenge to a hegemonic power often produces a war of hegemonic transition. Is realism a guide for dealing with the war on terror? Well, it's not a perfect framework for understanding radical Islamist reaction against the West, Al-Qaeda's militants, or other aspects of the problem. Al-Qaeda is a collection of transnational non-state actors. Al-Qaeda and many other terrorist groups are idealists more than realists. The conflict with the West is in large part a conflict of ideals. So perhaps constructivism and realism in some combination might be better than liberalism for diagnosing the Islamist terrorist threat. Liberalism would tend to emphasize the importance of spreading Western democracy and values as a way of getting at the root causes of terrorism. Now, I'm not trying to tar all liberals with this, given the unpopularity of the current president, but I'd say this is in large part the argument of the Bush the Younger's administration after September 11th. Their argument that American values are really universal values and that the challenge is to do in the evildoers in order to solve the problem. course, the counter-argument then is that Western values are in part what provokes the problem and energizes the opposition from radical Islamists. What about constructivism? Well, most of the constructivists we read in academia tend, at least in the norms they value, to be liberal in some form or other. The Huntington variant is somewhat different, where Huntington argues in favor of non-intervention in other culture areas as necessary to keep the clash of civilizations, which he believes is real, from becoming a war of civilizations, which he wants to avoid. And by the way, if, like so many people, your view of Huntington's argument is what appeared in the original article in Foreign Affairs 15 years ago, bear in mind that people often infer things from that that are not what he argues if you read the whole book, especially the last chapter. Sometimes realism and idealism converge, and sometimes realists are split. Convergence, for example, the titanic struggles against German fascism and Japanese militarism in the 1940s and against Soviet communism in the Cold War, united realists and liberals because all of those enemies combined both great military power and alien ideologies and values. Realists who are concerned with might and liberals who are concerned with right both pointed to a militant Western policy of war against the Axis and containment against the Soviet Union. This was not true after the Cold War. One of the reasons for the decline of realism in favor, it tends to follow events in the real world. After the Cold War, there was no major military threat to the West, no globe-spanning ideology to compete with Western liberalism on the same scale that Marxism-Leninism did. The issue is, should powerful states stand down and remain vigilant but restrained in intervention abroad, or should they take the opportunity to use force to advance Western values and reshape other countries in our image? Realists tend toward the former, non-interventionist view, as I argued, though they're not united in that, and liberals tend toward the latter, the Wilsonian use of force to reform non-liberal regimes or create a safer liberal international order. There are splits among realists, some interventionists, believing that bad regimes abroad will come to threaten Western security in the future. So, for example, in 2003, most realists probably opposed the American invasion of Iraq, but some who believed Saddam Hussein was crazy and might use WMD once he had enough, favored war. This was symbolized on the op-ed page of the New York Times on September 22nd, 2002, and there was a quarter-page anti-war ad signed by 33 scholars of security studies, mostly identified as realists, next to a huge op-ed essay by Ken Pollack, a disciple of Barry Posen, one of the signers of the ad, but recommending invasion. And sometimes anti-interventionist realists misjudge threats. E.H. Carr endorsed appeasement. Indeed, that was one of the principal motives behind that book. And Chamberlain was probably more realist than Churchill. Churchill was, if anything, an idealist. So were I and 32 others who signed that anti-invasion ad in September 2002 Chamberlains and Pollock Churchill? Don't think so, but you never know for sure until you get the verdict of history. I mean, we all think of Churchill as the savior of Western civilization now, but in June 1940, it didn't look like a very good bet. Britain was alone. Germany ruled the continent of Europe. What sense did it make to fight on when they might have struck a deal with Germany? And there's evidence that Hitler was willing to let the British keep their empire as long as they'd let him keep the continent. But Churchill said, no, we'll fight on the beaches, we'll fight in the hedgerows, we will never surrender. And there's one famous line of his that's really grisly. He says, if this island story of ours must end, let it be when all of us are lying on the ground choking in our own blood. Not a realist rationale that puts material interest above all. No, the basic problem was that E.H. Carr and Chamberlain and most other people at the time of the Munich Agreement in 1938 believed it was a great triumph because it avoided another catastrophe like World War I, and that Hitler, while he was a nasty, opportunistic statesman, was not crazy, and therefore he could do a deal with him. What they didn't recognize was that he was not a normal, opportunistic, realist statesman. They didn't realize that Hitler was an idealist who put his principles about the German folk and expansion to the east and other rights of the Germans, our whole society, that the only political debates in the United States are between contending schools within liberalism. So realism is not an answer to positive things that you want to accomplish to make the world a better place. But realism, I think, helps to suggest what's necessary to prevent negative developments that threaten to cripple your ability to do good. Well, I can follow up on any of that or any other things you want to bring up.